Hello, folks, and thank you for joining me once again for another spooky story. This is going to be a continuation of my creepy Christmas lineup that I started in the first week of December. I do hope you enjoy today's story. If you have been enjoying my videos, please give the video a little thumbs up, like it, please subscribe, and leave a comment, especially if you have a request for a particular ghost story or even just creepy story, and I will do my best to accommodate it. As a lot of you know, the only real stipulation that I have is that the story is in the public domain. But if there is something you would like for me to read, I would be more than happy to do that for you. I quite enjoy reading these stories. I know there's lots of people out there who enjoy being read to. I mean, that's the popularity of audiobooks. So if there is someone you know who you think would enjoy having a story read to them, maybe they're not really big readers in of themselves, please share the video around, and I hope that other people can be introduced to some of the great authors that we've been enjoying here on this channel. So, today we have the first half, because it is a little bit long for me to do in one video and still sound decent. We have a classic by Elizabeth Gaskell, who was an English novelist of the 19th century. She wrote a biography of one of the Bronte sisters. She wrote novels, short stories. She is now quite highly thought of, but of course at the time a lot of the literary critics, the majority of whom were male, tended to not be so fond of Mrs. Gaskell because she had the audacity to comment on social issues of the day, particularly poverty and things of that nature, which is going to come up in the story that I have for you today. So if you enjoy this, please do look for other works of hers. She is a fantastic writer. So what I have for you today is her story called... Oh dear, did I just close? No, I didn't. There we go. That would have been terrible. I have her story, The Old Nurse's Story, which is sort of a tale within a tale, because we do have a narrator that is relating all of this to someone else. I do hope you like it. It's not necessarily Christmas, but as I said, this group of videos I'm hoping to keep themed either directly to Christmas or at least winter themed, which is what this one is. Before I get into it, just the usual disclaimer that this is a Victorian ghost story. As I've already mentioned, poverty and classism in particular comes up in this one. There's also, if I recall correctly, some pretty hefty doses of sexism and misogyny, but just a general alert for all the sorts of things that a modern reader might find distasteful. Classism, racism, comments on people's gender, ethnicity, religion, orientation, all that sort of thing. It is, maybe not in this particular text, all of those things, but in general on this channel, those things are often present in the original text. And if you don't feel that this is right for you, feel free to just not consume the content. I understand perfectly if those are things that you don't want to hear about. Also, these are often ghost stories, macabre stories, horror stories. So also just a general advisory that these things often contain things like murders and suicides, and just the general circumstances that tend to lead to the creation of ghosts. So once again, if that is distasteful to you, feel free to just not consume the content. And I need some water already, which bodes really well for this quite long tale. All right, and that should do it for me for the preamble. So let's get right on into it with The Old Nurse's Story by Elizabeth Gaskell. Gaskell. However you want to say it. Nobody's here to police my pronunciation, so, whatever. You know, my dears, that your mother was an orphaned. Pardon me, I anticipate, because this is going to be longer, misspeaking perhaps a little bit more as my mouth starts to dry out. I also, in order to break this up so that I can read it a little more easily, had to copy-paste it from an online source, which means I might pause awkwardly while I notice misspellings or things with the format that make the text difficult to read. So I apologize in advance, and please do bear with me. You know, my dears, that your mother was an orphan and an only child, and dare I say you have heard that your grandfather was a clergyman up in Westmoreland, where I come from. I was just a girl in the village school when, one day, your grandmother came in to ask the mistress if there was any scholar there who would do for a nursemaid, and mighty proud I was, I can tell you, when the mistress called me up and spoke... Pardon me. Yeah, see, problems already. And spoke to my being a good girl at my needle and a steady, honest girl, and one whose parents were very respectable, though they might be poor. I thought I should like nothing better than to serve the pretty young lady, who was blushing as deep as I was, as she spoke of the coming baby, and what I should have to do with it. However, I see you don't care so much for this part of my story. As for what you think is to come, so I'll tell you at once. I was engaged and settled at the parsonage before Miss Rosamond, that was the baby, who was now your mother, was born. To be sure, I had little enough to do with her when she came, for she was never out of her mother's arms, and slept by her all night long, and proud enough was I sometimes when Mrs. trusted her to me. There never was such a baby before or since. Yeah, lots of parents say that, man. Though you've all of you been fine enough in your turns, but for sweet winning ways you've none of you come up to your mother. She took after her mother, who was a real lady born, a Miss Furnivall, a granddaughter of Lord Furnivall's in Northumberland. I believe she had neither brother nor sister, and had been brought up in my lord's family till she had married your grandfather, who was just a curate, son to a shopkeeper in Carlisle, but a clever, fine gentleman as ever was, and one who was a right down hard worker in his parish, which was very wide and scattered all abroad over the Westmoreland fells. When your mother, little Miss Rosamond, was about 4 or 5 years old, both her parents died in a fortnight, one after the other. Oh, that was a sad time. My pretty young mistress and me was looking for another baby. Looking after, I assume she means, not just looking for random babies. That would be weird. When my master come home from one of his long rides, wet and tired, and took the fever he died of, and then she never held up her head again, but just lived to see her dead baby and have it laid on her breast before she sighed away her life. My mistress had asked me on her deathbed never to leave Miss Rosamond, but if she had never spoken a word, I would have gone with the little child to the end of the world. But yeah, a little bit of classism there in the opening paragraphs, although that's pretty tragic, losing both of your parents at such a young age. However, before modern medicine, those kinds of things did happen. Childbirth was dangerous, getting sick was dangerous. But hey, as long as you're hardworking, or what other people perceive to be hardworking, you too can be good enough to serve a wealthy family and maybe even marry into them. The next thing, and before we had well stilled our sobs, the executors and guardians came to settle the affairs of the will of the inheritance, she means. There were my poor young mistress's own cousin, Lord Furnivall, and Mr. Esthwaite, my master's brother, a shopkeeper in Manchester, not so well-to-do as he was afterwards, and with a large family rising about him. Well, I don't know if it were their settling, or because of a letter my mistress wrote on her deathbed to her cousin, my lord, but somehow it was settled that Miss Rosamond and me were to go to Furnival Manor House in Northumberland, and my lord spoke as if it had been her mother's wish that she should live with his family, and as if he had no objections, for that one or two more or less could make no difference in such a grand household. So though that was not the way in which I should have wished the coming of my bright and pretty pet to have been looked at, who was like a sunbeam in any family, be it never so grand, I was well pleased that all the folks in the Dale should stare and admire when they heard I was going to be a young lady's maid at my Lord Furnival's at Furnival Manor. But I made a mistake in thinking we were to go and live where my lord did. It turned out that the family had left Furnival Manor 50 years or more. I could not hear that my poor young mistress had ever been there, though she had been brought up in the family, and I was sorry for that, for I should have liked Miss Rosamond's youth to have been passed where her mother's had been. My lord's gentleman, from whom I asked as many questions as I dared, said that the manor house was at the foot of the Cumberland Fells, and a very grand place, that an old Miss Furnival, a great-aunt of my lord's, lived there, with only a few servants, but that it was a very healthy place, and my lord had thought that it would suit Miss Rosamond very well for a few years, and that her being there might perhaps amuse his old aunt. I was bidden by my lord to have Miss Rosamond's things ready by a certain day. He was a stern, proud man, as they say all the Lord Furnivals were, and he never spoke a word more than was necessary. Folk did say he had loved my young mistress, but that because she knew that his father would object, she would never listen to him, and had married Mr. Esthwaite. But I don't know. He never married, at any rate, but he never took much notice of Miss Rosamond, which I thought he might have done if he had cared for her dead mother. He sent his gentleman with us to the manor house, telling him to join him at Newcastle that same evening. So there was no great length of time for him to make us known to all the strangers before he too shook us off, and we were left, two lonely young things, I was not 18, in the great old manor house. It seems like yesterday that we drove there. We had left our own dear parsonage very early, and we had both cried as if our hearts would break, though we were traveling in my lord's carriage, which I thought so much of once. And now it was long past noon on a September day, and we stopped to change the horses for the last time at a smoky town, all full of colliers and miners, collieries. Miss Rosamond had fallen asleep, but Mr. Henry told me to waken her, that she might see the park and the manor house as we drove up. I thought it rather a pity, but I did what he bade me, for fear he should complain of me to my lord. We had left all signs of a town, or even a village, and were then inside the gates of a large wild park, not like the parks here in the south, but with rocks and the noise of running water and gnarled thorn trees, and old oaks all white and peeled with age. The road went up about 2 miles, and then we saw a great and stately house with many trees close around it, so close that in some places their branches dragged against the walls when the wind blew, and some hung broken down, for no one seemed to take much charge of the place, to lop wood or to keep the moss-covered carriageway in order. Only in front of the house all was clear. The great oval drive was without a weed, and neither tree nor creeper was allowed to grow over the long, many-windowed front, at both sides of which a wing projected, which were each the ends of the other side fronts, for the house, although it was so desolate, was even grander than I expected. Behind it rose the fells, which seemed unenclosed and bare enough, and on the left hand of the house, as you stood facing it, was a little old-fashioned flower garden, as I found out afterwards. A door opened out upon it from the west front. It had been scooped out of thick, dark wood for some old lady Furnival, but the branches of the great forest trees had grown and overshadowed it again, and there were very few flowers that would live out there at that time. When we drove up to the great front entrance and went into the hall, I thought we should be lost, it was so large and vast and grand. There was a chandelier all of bronze hung down from the middle of the ceiling, and I had never seen one before, and I looked at it all in amaze. Then at one end of the hall was a great fireplace, as large as the sides of houses in my country, with massy andirons and dogs to hold the wood. So wood dogs, not like living dogs. They're made of brass. They're the arms that come out and kind of cup the logs if you're looking at a fireplace. Not dogs. Just don't think dogs. It's not that kind of dog. And by it were heavy, old-fashioned sofas. At the opposite end of the hall, to the left as you went in, on the western side, was an organ built into the wall, and so large that it filled up the best part of that end. Beyond it, on the same side, was a door, and opposite, on either side of the fireplace, were also doors leading to the east front. But those I never went through as long as I stayed at the house, so I can't tell you what lay beyond. It certainly sounds fancy, doesn't it? The afternoon was closing in, and the hall, which had no fire lighted in it, looked dark and gloomy, but we did not stay there a moment. The old servant who had opened the door for us bowed to Mr. Henry and took us in through the door at the further side of the great organ, and led us through several smaller halls and passages into the west drawing room, where he said that Miss Furnival was sitting. Poor little Miss Rosamond held very tight to me, as if she were scared and lost in that great place, and as for myself, I was not much better. The west drawing room was very cheerful looking, with a warm fire in it, and plenty of good, comfortable furniture about. Miss Furnival was an old lady not far from 80. I should not think, but I do not know. She was thin and tall, and had a face as full of fine wrinkles as if they had been drawn all over it with a needle's point. Her eyes were very watchful, to make up, I suppose, for her being so deaf, as to be obligated to use a trumpet. Okay. I get that it's horror and macabre, but ear trumpets will never not be hilarious. You should Google them if you don't know what that is. I get that it was a way to help people losing their hearing, but also, they're fucking funny. Sitting with her, working at the same great piece of tapestry, was Mrs. Stark, her maid and companion, and almost as old as she was. She had lived with Miss Furnival ever since they were both young, and now she seemed more like a friend than a servant. She looked so cold and gray and stony, as if she had never loved or cared for anyone. And I don't suppose she did care for anyone, except her mistress, and owing to the great deafness of the latter, Mrs. Stark treated her very much as if she were a child. Mr. Henry gave some message from my lord, and then he bowed goodbye to us all, taking no notice of my sweet little Rosamond's outstretched hand, and left us standing there, being looked at by the two old ladies through their spectacles. So, I get the narrator is really young herself, but, and a lot of people with kids or who care for kids do this, just because the child is your world does not mean that the child is the world of everybody else around them. Mr. Henry is Lord Furnival's servant, first and foremost. He's got to go and, serve the guy that's paying him. I get that you like this little kid, but I kind of find it annoying how much she expects everybody else to love the kid as much as she does. I think that's weird. Even when modern parents are like that and they do that whole baby stalking thing, that's weird. You love your kid, that's great. I am not obligated to. I'll just get off my soapbox now. I was right glad when they rung for the old footman who had shown us in at first, and told him to take us to our rooms. So we went out of that great drawing room and into another sitting room, and out of that, and then up a great flight of stairs, and along a broad gallery, which was something like a library, having books all down one side, and windows and writing tables all down the other, till we came to our rooms, which I was not sorry to hear were just over the kitchen, for I began to think I should be lost in that wilderness of a house. Girl, same, it sounds super complicated. There was an old nursery that had been used for all the little lords and ladies long ago, with a pleasant fire burning in the grate and the kettle boiling on the hob, and tea things spread out on the table. and out of that room was the night nursery, with a little crib for Miss Rosamond close to my bed, and old James called up Dorothy, his wife, to bid us welcome, and both he and she were so hospitable and kind that by and by Miss Rosamond and me felt quite at home, and by the time tea was over, she was sitting on Dorothy's knee and chattering away as fast as her little tongue could go. I soon found out that Dorothy was from Westmoreland, and that bound her and me together, and, as it were, I would never wish to meet with kinder people than were old James and his wife. James had lived pretty nearly all his life in my lord's family, and thought there was no one so grand as they. He even looked down a little on his wife, because, till he married her, she had never lived in any but a farmer's household. What a prick. But he was very fond of her. Oh, how good of him. As well he might be. They had one servant under them to do all the rough work. Agnes, they called her. And she and me and James and Dorothy, with Miss Furnival and Mrs. Stark, made up the family, always remembering my sweet little Miss Rosamond. I used to wonder what they had done before she came. They thought so much of her now. Kitchen and drawing room, it was all the same. The hard, sad Miss Furnival and the cold Mrs. Stark looked pleased when she came fluttering in like a bird, playing and pranking hither and thither, with a continual murmur and pretty prattle of gladness. I don't like that she keeps calling Mrs. Stark cold. Like, you don't know her life story. Also, just because someone's personality is not what you think it is, doesn't mean that they're cold or unfeeling. Not everybody trips over themselves to fawn over toddlers. That's how the world is. I am sure they were sorry many a time when she flitted away into the kitchen, though they were too proud to ask her to stay with them, and were a little surprised at her taste, though to be sure, as Mrs. Stark said, it was not to be wondering at, remembering what stock her father had come of. Throwing some shade on the child's ancestry there. That's great. The great old rambling house was a famous place for little Miss Rosamond. She made expeditions all over it, with me at her heels, all except the east wing, which was never opened, and whither we never thought of going. It's forbidden, like the west wing in Beauty and the Beast. But in the western and northern part was many a pleasant room, full of things that were curiosities to us, though they might not have been to people who had seen more. The windows were darkened by the sweeping boughs of the trees, and the ivy which had overgrown them. But in the green gloom we could manage to see old china jars and carved ivory boxes and great heavy books, and above all, the old pictures. So, by which of course she probably means paintings in this time period. Just to clarify for you. Once, I remember, my darling would have Dorothy go with us to tell us who they all were, for they were all portraits of some of my lord's family, though Dorothy could not tell us the names of everyone. We had gone through most of the rooms when we came to the old state drawing room over the hall, and there was a picture of Miss Furnival, or as she was called in those days, Miss Grace, for she was the younger sister. Such a beauty she must have been, with such a set, proud look and such scorn looking out of her handsome eyes, with her eyebrows just a little raised, as if she wondered how anyone could have the impertinence to look at her, and her lip curled at us as we stood there gazing. She had a dress on the like of which I had never seen before, but was all the fashion when she was young, a hat of some soft white stuff like beaver, pulled a little over her brows, and a beautiful plume of feathers sweeping round it on one side, and her gown of blue satins was opened in front to a quilted white stomacher. Well, to be sure, said I, when I had gazed my fill, flesh is grass, as they do say, but who would have thought that Miss Furnival had been such an out-and-out beauty to see her now? Yeah, who'd have thought? People aged. Revolutionary! Yes, said Dorothy, folks change, sadly. But if what my master's father used to say was true, Miss Furnival, the elder sister, was handsomer than Miss Grace. Her picture is here somewhere, but if I show it to you, you must never let on, even to James, that you have seen it. Can the little lady hold her tongue, think you? She asked. I was not so sure, for she was such a sweet little child, bold and open, so I set her to hide herself, and then I helped Dorothy to turn a great picture that leaned with its face towards the wall, and was not hung up as the others were. To be sure, it beat Miss Grace for beauty, and I think for scornful pride, though in that matter it might be hard to choose. I could have looked at it in an hour, but Dorothy seemed half frightened at having shown it to me, and hurried it back again, and bade me run and find Miss Rosamond, for that there were some ugly places about the house where she should like ill for the child to go. I was a brave, high-spirited girl, and thought little of what the old woman said, for I liked hide-and-seek as well as any child of the parish, so off I ran to find my little one. As winter drew on and the days grew shorter, I was sometimes almost certain that I heard a noise as if someone was playing on the great organ in the hall. I did not hear it every evening, but certainly I did very often, usually when I was sitting with Miss Rosamond after I had put her to bed, and keeping quite still and silent in the bedroom. Then I used to hear it booming and swelling away in the distance. The first night, when I went down to my supper, I asked Dorothy who had been playing music, and James said very shortly that I was a gawk to take the wind sighing among the trees for music. But I saw Dorothy look at him very fearfully, and Bessie, the kitchen maid, said something beneath her breath and went quite white. I saw they did not like my question, so I held my peace till I was with Dorothy alone, when I knew I could get a good deal out of her. So the next day I watched my time, and I coaxed and asked her who it was that played the organ, for I knew that it was the organ and not the wind swell, for I had kept silent, and not the winds well enough, for all I had kept silent since before James. But Dorothy had had her lesson, I'll warrant, and never a word could I get from her. So then I tried Bessie, though I had always held my head rather above her, as I was even to James and Dorothy, and she was little better than their servant. Wow, I told you that there's some strong classism in this one. So she said I must never, never tell, and if ever I told, I was never to say she had told me. But it was a very strange noise, and she had heard it many a time, but most of all on winter nights and before storms, and folks did say it was the old lord playing on the great organ in the hall, just as he used to when he was alive. But who the old lord was, or why he played, and why he played on stormy winter evenings in particular, she either could not or would not tell me. Well, I tell you, I had a brave heart, and I thought it was rather pleasant to have that grand music rolling about the house. Let who would be the player, for now it rose above the great gusts of wind and wailed and triumphed just like a living creature, and then it fell to a softness most complete. Only it was always music and tune, so it was nonsense to call it wind. I thought at first that it might be Miss Furnivall who played, unknown to Bessie, but one night, when I was in the hall by myself, I opened the organ and peeped all about and around it, as I had done to the organ in Crosswaite Church once before, and I saw that it was all broken and destroyed inside, though it looked so brave and fine, and then, though it was noonday, my flesh began to creep a little, and I shut it up and ran away pretty quickly to my own bright nursery, and I did not like hearing the music for some time after that any more than James and Dorothy did. All this time, Miss Rosamond was making herself more and more beloved. The old ladies liked her to dine with them at their early dinner. James stood behind Miss Furnivall's chair, and I behind Miss Rosamond's, all in state, and after dinner she would play about in a corner of the great drawing-room as still as any mouse, while Miss Furnivall slept, and I had my dinner in the kitchen. But she was glad enough to come to me in the nursery afterwards, for, as she said, Miss Furnivall was so sad, and Mrs. Stark so dull. But she was merry enough, and by I got not to care for that weird rolling music, which did no harm, even if we did not know where it came from. That winter was very cold. In the middle of October, the frosts began and lasted many, many weeks. I remember one day at dinner, Miss Furnivall lifted up her sad, heavy eyes and said to Mrs. Stark, "I am afraid we shall have a terrible winter," in a strange kind of meaning way. But Mrs. Stark pretended not to hear her and talked very loud of something else. My little lady and I did not care for the frost, not we. As long as it was dry, we climbed up the steep brows behind the house and went up on the fells, which were bleak and bare enough. And there we ran races in the fresh, sharp air, and once we came down by a new path that took us past the two old gnarled holly trees which grew out about halfway down by the east side of the house. But the days grew shorter and shorter, and the old lord, if it was he, played away, and more stormily and sadly upon the great organ. One Sunday afternoon, it must have been towards the end of November, I asked Dorothy to take charge of the little missy when she came out of the drawing room, after Miss Furnivall had had her nap, for it was too cold to take her with me to church, and yet I wanted to go. And Dorothy was glad enough to promise, and was so fond of the child that all seemed well. And Bessie and I set off very briskly, though the sky hung heavy and black over the white earth, as if the night had never fully gone away, and the air, though still, was very biting. "We shall have a fall of snow," said Bessie to me, and sure enough, even while we were in church, it came down thick in great large flakes, so thick it almost darkened the windows. It had stopped snowing before we came out, but it lay soft, thick, and deep beneath our feet as we tramped home. Before we got to the hall, the moon rose, and I think it was lighter then, what with the moon and with the dazzling white snow, than it had been when we went to church. Between 2 and 3 o'clock, I had not told you that Miss Furnivall and Mrs. Stark never went to church. They used to read the prayers together in their quiet, gloomy way. They seemed to feel the Sunday very long without their tapestry work to be busy at. So when I went to Dorothy in the kitchen to fetch Miss Rosamond and take her upstairs with me, I did not much wonder when the old woman told me that the ladies had kept the child with them, and that she had never come to the kitchen, as I had bidden her, when she was tired of behaving in the pretty drawing room. So I took off my things and went to find her, and bring her to supper in the nursery. But when I went into the best drawing room, there sat the two old ladies, very still and quiet, dropping out a word now and then, but looking as if nothing so bright and merry as Miss Rosamond had ever been near them. So I thought she might be hiding from me. It was one of her pretty ways. That actually just sounds really annoying. And that she had persuaded them to look as if they knew nothing about her. So I went softly peeping under this sofa and behind that chair, making believe I was sadly frightened at not finding her. "What's the matter, Hester?" said Mrs. Stark sharply. I don't know if Miss Furnivall had seen me, for as I told you, she was very deaf. I don't know why that would mean she couldn't see you. And she sat quite still, idly staring into the fire with her hopeless face. "I'm only looking for my little Rosy Posy," replied I, still thinking that the child was still there and near me, though I could not see her. "Miss Rosamond is not here," said Mrs. Stark. "She went away more than an hour ago to find Dorothy." And she too turned and went on looking into the fire. My heart sank at this, and I began to wish I had never left my darling. I went back to Dorothy and told her. James was gone out for the day, but she and me and Bessie took lights and went up into the nursery first. And then we roamed over the great large house, calling and entreating Miss Rosamond to come out of her hiding place, and not frighten us to death in that way. But there was no answer, no sound. "Oh," said I at last, "can she have got out into the east wing and hidden there?" But Dorothy said it was not possible, for that she herself had never been in there, that the doors were always locked, and my lord's steward had the keys, she believed, at any rate. Neither she nor James had ever seen them. So I said I would go back and see if, after all, she was not hidden in the drawing room, unknown to the old ladies. And if I found her there, I said, I would whip her well for the fright she had given me. But I never meant to do it. Well, I went back to the drawing room, and I told Mrs. Stark we could not find her anywhere, and asked for leave to look all about the furniture there, for I thought now that she might have fallen asleep in some warm, hidden corner. But no, we looked. Miss Furnivall got up and looked, trembling all over, and she was nowhere there. And we set off again, everyone in the house, and looked in all the places we had searched before, but we could not find her. Miss Furnivall shivered and shook so much that Mrs. Stark took her back into the drawing room, but not before they had made me promise to bring her to them when she was found. Well a day! I began to think she would never be found, when I bethought to look out into the great front hall court, all covered with snow. I was upstairs when I looked out, but it was such clear moonlight I could see quite plain 2 little footprints, which might be traced from the front hall door and round the corner of the east wing. I don't know how I got down, but I tugged open the great stiff hall door, and throwing the skirt of my gown over my head for a cloak, I ran out. I turned the east corner, and there was a black shadow fell on the snow, but when I came again into the moonlight, there were little footmarks going up to the fells. It was bitter cold, so cold that the air almost took the skin off my face as I ran. But I ran on, crying to think how my poor little darling must be perished and frightened. Well, she dead, she not scared. I was within sight of the holly trees when I saw a shepherd coming down the hill, bearing something in his arms wrapped in his maud. So his winter wrap. He shouted to me and asked if I had lost a bairn, and when I could not speak for crying, he bore towards me, and I saw my wee bairnie lying still and white and stiff in his arms, as if she had been dead. He told me he had been up to the fells to gather his sheep before the deep cold of night came on, and that under the holly trees, black marks on the hillside where no other bush was for miles around, he had found my little lady, my lamb, my queen, my darling, stiff and cold in the terrible sleep which is frost begotten. Oh, the joy and the tears of having her in my arms again! I, for one, would not let him carry her, but took her, Maud and all, into my arms and held her near my own warm neck, and felt the life stealing slowly back again into her little gentle limbs. I mean, give the guy his winter clothing back, lady. But she was still insensible when we reached the hall, and I had no breath for speech. We went in by the kitchen door. "Bring the warming pan," said I, and I carried her upstairs and began undressing her by the nursery fire, which Bessie had kept up. I called my little Lammy all the sweet and playful names I could think of, even while my eyes were blinded by my tears, and at last, oh, at length, she opened her large blue eyes. Then I put her into her warm bed and sent Dorothy down to tell Miss Furnivall that all was well, and I made up my mind to sit by my darling's bedside in the livelong night. She fell away into a soft sleep as soon as her pretty head touched the pillow, and I watched by her till morning light, when she awakened up bright and clear, or so I thought at first, and so my dears, so I think now. And that is where I'm going to leave it for the first half of The Old Nurse's Tale by Elizabeth Gaskell. So we have a creepy old manor house inhabited almost exclusively by elderly people, a handful of servants, and a creepy organ that plays itself during winter storms. So stay tuned. What will happen with the little girl, and will we discover who plays the organ and why? Please join me in the next video for the conclusion of The Nurse's Tale by Elizabeth Gaskell. What is this? Why